Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. As you've just heard, and as you've seen large letters on that screen over there, my name's Patrick Worsnip, and I've been the Reuters chief correspondent at the United Nations for the past 5 years. Because I have a UN building pass, and because my office is in this compound, I sometimes find it necessary to explain to people that I don't actually work for the United Nations. On the contrary, I write about it. Those who, like me, spend a lot of time reading UN statements will notice that they have a strange, sort of constipated quality about them, which is due to the fact that the United Nations is very anxious to avoid offending any of its 193 members. I'm very happy to offend all 193 of them, and the United Nations as well. Also, I'm not speaking here for the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, who simply invited me to address you and may not agree at all with what I'm saying. And as regards my employers, Reuters news agency, I have to give you the customary health warning that I'm not speaking for them either. I do share the publicly stated commitment of what the novelist and poet Lawrence Durrell, who once worked as a press officer for the British government, used to call Neuters news agency, to objectivity in news coverage, but the views you're going to hear are entirely my own. Okay, cultural diplomacy and the UN. What is cultural diplomacy? According to the Institute's website, its goal is, and I quote, to promote global peace and stability by strengthening and supporting intercultural relations at all levels, unquote. That's a goal I'm sure the United Nations would endorse, and I will consider how it seeks to do so. But with your permission, I'd like to then broaden out the discussion to consider the use by the United Nations of broadly non-violent means to promote global peace and resolve conflicts. Stalin once famously asked, "How many legions does the Pope have?" You could ask the same question of the United Nations. Technically, the answer is that it does actually have some legions, in the shape of its blue-helmeted peacekeeping troops, more than 100,000 of them. But that probably wasn't what Stalin had in mind. The fact is that with a couple of unusual exceptions, which we'll look at later, the United Nations has not in recent decades gone around trying to impose settlements by military force. It relies primarily on its version of soft power, persuasion and authority, backed up in some cases by economic sanctions imposed by the Security Council, which, if you will, are a form of hard power. But as anyone in the UN Secretariat will tell you, the Security Council is a different animal. To start off with, let's look at the cultural bodies the UN has at its disposal. Inevitably, one thinks first of UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization based in Paris. If you asked anyone at UNESCO, I'd bet they'd say they are striving for world peace through cultural means. But how realistic is that? The agency has, in fact, from time to time found itself generating controversy as much as resolving it. It became a subject of hot debate among journalists about 30 years ago through its involvement in attempts to promote something called the New World Information and Communications Order, which was strongly opposed by the United States and Britain as a bid to impose supranational control over the media. No one talks much about that issue anymore, and UNESCO is probably best known nowadays for its declaration of cultural heritage sites around the world. But that too can be thorny ground, witness Israeli-Palestinian rivalry over potential sites in the West Bank. And UNESCO ignited a political firestorm when it admitted the Palestinian Authority as a member last year in the teeth of opposition from Israel and the United States. Then there's the Alliance of Civilizations, a body founded in 2005 to, and again I quote the website, improve cross-cultural relations between diverse nations and communities. The very title of the organization looks like an attempt to rebut the theory of the clash of civilizations advanced in the 1990s by the US political scientist Samuel Huntington, who argued that people's cultural and religious identities will be the main source of conflict in the post-Cold War world. The alliance was promulgated by the leaders of Christian Spain and Muslim Turkey, and while one shouldn't blame governments for the actions of their predecessors, it's hard not to notice that both those nations have a somewhat spotty historical record when it comes to allying with other civilizations. What does the organization actually do? Its chief, former Portuguese President Jorge Sampaio, seeks to spell this out in annual reports to the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. The latest one, from last year, is largely a recital of meetings aimed at boosting cultural dialogue. But in paragraph 19, we come up with a crunch against this, quote, Bloodshed linked to terrorist attacks and a rise in intercultural tensions and intolerance seems to have increased in many parts of the world, including in democratic societies. Confronting this trend towards extremism and intolerance is the raison d'etre of the alliance and should therefore remain its main priority." Unquote. In other words, for all the admirable efforts of the Alliance of Civilizations and UNESCO, it seems to be an uphill struggle. Don't get me wrong here, I'm not just another cynical journalist disparaging the efforts of those who are trying to improve the world. One of the people I most admire is the musician Daniel Barenboim, ever since I saw him play the piano at my high school in England in the 1960s. He has attempted to break down barriers between ordinary Israelis and Arabs by getting them to play classical music together. But can one say that overall mutual trust between the two peoples has increased in recent years? I think the only honest answer to that is no. In fact, it's diminished. Does that mean Barenboim should give up his efforts? Of course not. Why do the promoters of the cultural approach to healing the world's political ills seem to be swimming against the tide? There could be many answers. For one thing, culture isn't simply politically neutral. When revolutionary ideologues around the world talk about Western imperialism, they don't just mean Western warships cruising off their shores. They also have in mind a compulsory global diet of Big Macs and Hollywood movies that promote values they oppose. Just last week, a colleague of mine in Tehran wrote a story about how middle-class Iranians there were trying to celebrate Valentine's Day. But the authorities were trying to stop them, among other things, by banning the sale of red roses. Valentine's Day, as far as they were concerned, was a manifestation of corrupt Western culture. Whether it's the Iranian fatwa against author Salman Rushdie, or the Taliban's destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan in 2001, culture is on the front lines of the political struggles in today's world. And if we expand the term culture to include also religion, you don't have to be an atheist like Christopher Hitchens to accept that religion has been the direct cause of wars going back many centuries, as well as an obstacle to peace. I've heard various explanations for what went wrong at the Camp David negotiations in 2000 between Israel and the Palestinians, but the most convincing is that the real deal breaker was who would control Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, an issue of little or no strategic importance but full of religious historical significance. So here's where I'd like to step back a bit to get a broader picture of what's been going on in the last 20 years or so and put culture and diplomacy in a wider context. Around the end of the Cold War, the American scholar Francis Fukuyama famously wrote about what he called the end of history. Although the term was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, he argued that with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the world's ideological conflicts were essentially over, and all countries were more or less agreed that the future lay with liberal democracy and free market economics. The theory was much derided even at the time, and Fukuyama himself has since modified it. But I think he was right about one thing. With the end of communism, except in one or two holdout countries like North Korea and Cuba, its great enemy capitalism, a system devised in Europe and greatly developed by the United States, has finally established itself as the only economic game in town. You either take part or you face economic ruination. Small wonder that areas of the world that have no history of capitalist enterprise remain mired in poverty. Even in the developed world, countries that have not understood the rules, or at least have not abided by them, such as Greece, have faced severe difficulties. The world's cultural conflicts have partly to be seen against this background, since the pervasive spread of Hollywood movies, to cite just the example I mentioned before, reflects market forces. Politically, the end of the Cold War unleashed major centrifugal forces that had already been building up earlier in the 20th century. The Soviet Union split into 15 countries, Yugoslavia split into 6 or 7 if you include Kosovo. Czechoslovakia divided into 2, East Timor broke away from Indonesia, and Eritrea from Ethiopia. In the most recent example, Sudan broke into 2 last year, and the process maybe isn't over yet. In my own country, Britain, Scotland will vote on independence in 2014, and Belgium has long looked fragile. It's all been great business for the people who manufacture country nameplates for the United Nations, whose membership, as I mentioned at the start, has risen to 193. So while some developing countries continue to rail at what they see as the overweening behaviour of the big powers, I would argue that this has been the era of the small state. The reason is not hard to see. Minorities have increasingly refused to be governed by people of a different ethnic or religious group. And when you consider the atrocities inflicted on minorities in the 20th century, of which the most dramatic example was the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews in the 1940s, you can hardly be surprised that their reaction was, where the opportunity presented itself, to create a state of their own. It has sometimes made economic sense as well. Tiny but prosperous Slovenia, for example, did not see why it should subsidize much poorer southern Yugoslavia, and had the example of minuscule but wealthy states like Luxembourg and Monaco as proof of the adage that small is beautiful. So surprising this trend is not, but on the other hand, it hasn't exactly encouraged ethnic tolerance and coexistence. Even where countries avoided the fate of a Yugoslav-style violent breakup, they have sometimes found themselves in conflict later, as with Eritrea and Ethiopia. And in some cases, yesterday's oppressed minority has become today's oppressive majority. Many observers have hailed the spread of democracy in recent decades, but contrary to what you sometimes hear, this hasn't always benefited cultural tolerance. If most people in a given country want to oppress a minority, then woe betide that minority in a democracy. While minorities have often been the victims of dictators, there have been instances when they've been better off, as we've seen in the Middle East from time to time. Since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, for instance, there's been a steady exodus of Christians from the region who have felt unwelcome among the Muslim majority. It continues to this day and may be speeded up by the events of the Arab Spring. I don't want to go into bat for dictatorships, obviously, though I do sometimes have this fantasy that if Israel had been ruled not by a democracy but by a dictatorship similar to that which existed in Egypt until recently, we'd have had a Middle East peace settlement a long time ago. My general point is that democracy can have its downsides. As has been said, it's the worst system of government except for all the others. How has the United Nations responded to these turbulent changes in which inevitably it has been caught up in a way that goes well beyond the simple increase in its membership? In the 1990s, the ethnic intolerance that I've been talking about exploded into atrocities in Bosnia and Rwanda that exposed serious weaknesses in the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations, which was widely blamed for failing to prevent the massacres that took place. This led in turn, rather belatedly, to a World Summit in 2005 that conceived, and in fact fathered upon a somewhat reluctant United Nations, something called the responsibility to protect. I don't want to get into a lengthy discussion of this, since it could be, and indeed has been, the subject of separate conferences. And incidentally, I believe there's an anti-R2P conference going on not very far from here. In brief, my view of it is that responsibility to protect is a cruel deception. The concept stated that if a government failed to protect its populations from atrocities, or was in fact perpetrating them, the international community must be prepared to take measures, including the collective use of force, through the UN Security Council. This fulfilled the dreams of many NGOs, who imagined that every time some government started maltreating its people, the United Nations would march in and stop it. In reality, that isn't going to happen, and the concept was never thought through. Talk to anyone in the UN Peacekeeping Department, and they'll tell you that their forces are not mandated or equipped to take on government armies. And as for the Security Council, you only have to look at recent events to see how divided they are on issues of this kind. Now, there were two cases last year that did appear to show the responsibility to protect in action. One was in Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, where UN peacekeepers were involved in the final defeat and capture of the autocrat Laurent Gbagbo. The other was, of course, in Libya, where a Security Council resolution led ultimately to the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. But in Côte d'Ivoire, the role of French forces was decisive, and in Libya, there were no UN forces, and it was NATO's sophisticated weaponry that achieved the outcome. The moral: civilians will be protected when the big powers decide it is in their interests that they should be, and more importantly, can agree to do it, like not in Syria. After Libya, Russia and China have vowed never again. So, peacekeepers aside, what tools does the United Nations have at its disposal? Well, it does have a formal mediating role in some disputes, such as those in Western Sahara and Cyprus. So far, and of course you can't rule out that things might change one day, but so far it's been spectacularly unsuccessful. Why so? Partly, of course, the nature of the disputes themselves. The curse of all negotiations is an attitude by the parties that the status quo, however bad, is still better than the compromises they would have to make to achieve a settlement. It's bad enough when one of the two parties holds that view. When both do, it's almost hopeless. One almost comic example of UN ability to break through that Gordian knot has been its failure so far to negotiate a name for a country presently known around here as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or FYROM, that would be acceptable to Greece. The UN is wont to offer what it calls its good offices in these sorts of disputes, but the sad truth is that all too often good offices just don't cut the mustard. By its nature, the United Nations is prevented from using the kind of head-banging diplomacy that enabled, for example, the late US diplomat Richard Holbrooke to bully and cajole the warring factions in Bosnia into a peace deal in 1995. Now, you may feel I'm being a little harsh on our hosts here. I haven't, for example, mentioned something that's gaining ground in UN corridors, which is the notion of preventive diplomacy, getting in before it's too late. You could argue that UN efforts in Yemen, for example, have helped to bring about a settlement that, while it may not have prevented all violence, has averted a total cataclysm, at least up till now. So I'd like to end on a slightly more positive note. I said earlier that this has been the age of the small state, but it's also been the age of international bureaucracies. Bureaucracy usually gets a bad rap. It's associated with inefficiency, waste and corruption, all things that certainly exist in the United Nations. But just as I mentioned the downsides of democracy, I'd like to say something about the upsides of bureaucracy. Certainly the most successful, in my view, has been the European Union, widely criticised for everything from its inability to prevent the euro crisis to its absurd regulations on the curvature of bananas. It does have some pretty impressive achievements to its credit. In particular, it's played a major role in ensuring that the nations of Western Europe, who started the last two world wars, have been at peace with each other for some two-thirds of a century. But the United Nations, for all its failings, deserves some credit too. People often ask me how effective I think it is. I've taken to quoting my compatriot, the 18th century man of letters, Samuel Johnson. Speaking in an age long before political correctness, he compared women preaching to dogs walking on their hind legs. "Sir," he said, "it is not done well, but you are surprised to find it done at all." I think that applies also to the activities of the United Nations, given that the organisation is answerable to 193 masters. In fact, its inclusiveness is its main strength. And that's why critics, especially in the United States, who rage at the fact that the UN contains what they consider rogue states, and that, heaven forfend, those nations sometimes end up serving their turn chairing this or that committee, seem to me to so totally miss the point. The advantage of the United Nations is that it does have room for those bad guys. If you want an organisation that just consists of good guys, there's plenty of them around. Being a member of an international organisation brings certain responsibilities, even if you don't want to fulfil them. It provides a space where you associate with the rest of the world, even if you are forbidden to talk directly to your enemies or they to you. Furthermore, any state contemplating an act of international aggression knows that almost immediately the issue will get referred to the United Nations and or other organisations, entangling it in a web of international bureaucracy, debates, reports, resolutions, fact-finding missions, inquiries and the like, not to mention possible sanctions or referral to the International Criminal Court, all of which almost makes it hardly worth pursuing the contemplated act. Okay, I'm being flippant here. Is any of this in the final analysis really going to stop a determined aggressor? Probably not. You only have to read the newspapers to see horrible, vicious acts being carried out every day somewhere in the world. But it seems to me that in some cases the convoluted mechanisms of the United Nations and its sister organisations can still restrain, delay and obstruct them. And UN peacekeepers are at their most effective in their classic role of an interposition force when they serve as an alibi for combatants who have stopped fighting to refrain from resuming. In other words, the United Nations might deter international conflicts less by what it does than by default, simply by being there. Now, I'm aware that I'm speaking at a time when the limits of UN effectiveness are being painfully exposed in Syria, even though I would argue that the system has still kicked in there. But let's look at the historical record. The psychologist Steven Pinker, in his latest book, has suggested that despite appearances to the contrary, wars are actually going out of fashion. The last war between different states, defined as one in which more than 1,000 people died in a year, was the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Most conflicts these days are internal ones, no less brutal, but probably less of a threat to international peace and security in that hallowed UN phrase. The worst of those, in Afghanistan and recently in Syria, each with an annual toll of about 5,000, still kill only a fraction of the victims of the Vietnam War, which had an annual death rate of nearly 150,000 Vietnamese and 5,000 Americans. Most importantly, since World War II, the worst disaster ever to hit mankind with an overall death toll of at least 60 million, there has been no global war, even though there have been a couple of close shaves, and even though some people think Iran and Israel might still between them touch off a conflict with worldwide repercussions. Various theories have been advanced for this, ranging from the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons to the fact that wars of conquest are no longer cost-effective. But the post-1945 period also coincides with the existence of the United Nations. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Worsnip. Let's take a few questions from this side of the room this time.
Hi there, I'm Ellie Richard, and thank you so much for your talk. I'm from North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, master's program in peace and conflict studies. And I would love to hear more about what you're hearing in the corridors about preventive diplomacy.
Well, it's something that's still in its infancy, I think. As I say, it has been prominent with Yemen, where the UN envoy Jamal Benomar has been visiting frequently in recent months, and he, although the peace deal for Yemen was conceived by the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is an alliance of the 6 Gulf Arab states. Benomar played a significant role in actually getting the parties to go along with it. He's not a well-known person, but he's probably been one of the most successful UN officials, I think, of the recent times. Where else it's in progress, I couldn't really say. I mean, it's something that's been talked about quite a lot in the Department of Political Affairs here, run by Lynn Pascoe. You know, I think at the moment it exists kind of in theory, on paper, more than in reality.
Do we have another question anyway?
I just want to make sure. Yeah.
Hi, here. I was talking with Mikhail Gorbachev at the UN headquarters in Geneva a couple of years ago when I was studying there, and he stated an opinion that the existence of organizations such as NATO, where you have the Western powers basically exhibiting their force and their geopolitical strength in other spheres, it definitely does limit the amount of strife that occurs in, let's say, you know, more developed nations, and you know, we've seen their power in Libya, but it also exists as a deterrent to nuclear deproliferation, as a lot of states wish to keep their trump card, if you will. So I'm curious to see your impression of either that organization or organizations such as the UN in acting, yes, perhaps as a damper on the violence that we see now, but as an obstacle to additional improvemements.
The UN is an obstacle to additional improvements?
Right, yes.
In what exactly?
Greater establishment of peace, nuclear deproliferation, reduction in weapons stores, basically a more, a less tenuous peace and more of an honest agreement of, you know, let's not go kill each other.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, firstly, on NATO, I mean, I think famously, it's an example of an organisation which rather sort of lost its role some time ago, 20 years ago, with the end of the Cold War. I mean, it was obviously created to defend Western Europe against the Soviet bloc, and once the Soviet bloc ceased to exist, and many of its members, in fact, joined NATO. Then, I mean, ever since then, effectively, it's been shopping around for a raison d'etre. I mean, nobody's been willing to disband it. And on the contrary, countries have wanted to join it. The Eastern European countries have joined it basically because they don't really believe that Russia is kind of dead as a threat, and they're sort of protecting themselves or ensuring themselves against, you know, a sort of resurgent Russia in the future. But I mean, that's kind of hardly a role really, and we've seen it sort of groping around, really, you know, looking for somewhere to operate. And it's been in Afghanistan, as everyone knows, where it's, you know, its efforts have been sort of somewhat, you know, questionable, I think, you know, in terms of success. And you know, it was involved in Libya, so it's kind of it's become a sort of ad hoc, you know, military alliance that, you know, kind of gun for hire almost. You know, I think it's kind of a problematic organisation in that sense. But as I say, it's built up such a kind of historical, you know, impetus that no one's going to say, well, we don't really need this anymore, so let's not have it. On the UN and how it prevents nuclear non-proliferation. I mean, I think probably the UN people would strongly kind of disagree with that statement. I mean, they you know, there's a whole sort of section of it which is devoted to disarmament. Nuclear non-proliferation is one of its chief goals, and you know, so I mean, it's kind of on board in that sense, but I mean, how effective it's been is a different matter. I mean, obviously, you know, there's the IAEA in Vienna, which you know, has been deeply involved in you know, in the Iran drama. But you know, it hasn't succeeded in killing off the idea that, you know, if you have nuclear weapons, you're really somebody, and you know, and that you know, the nuclear weapons are the key to sort of political power and getting your way regionally, which is an idea that clearly, you know, exists in many places and could, you know, ultimately lead to you know, a massive proliferation of nuclear weapons, despite all the efforts against it. I mean, my personal view, but I won't go into it at great length, is that, you know, I mean, nuclear weapons are the sort of great kind of unusable weapons of all time, and that their importance has been greatly overrated. But you know, that's a very long debate. I don't want to start.
Yes. Hello, I'm Matteo Chan. I study history at Columbia. I was wondering on your take on Turkey and Turkey's chances and possibilities by soft power and cultural diplomacy of exerting influence.
Its potential is quite great. You know, it's been held up by many countries. I mean, both Arab countries and some European countries, like people in France, for example, as, you know, as the great example of what you know, a moderate Islamic country can be. You know, it's kind of, it's got a fairly dynamic economy. It's you know, in terms of civil liberties, it's kind of not bad, if not perfect. You know, I mean, there are a lot of people who wish, you know, if only all, you know, Middle Eastern countries were like this, then, you know, things would really be a lot better. Now, you know, clearly it's up to Turkey how it, you know, how it uses that potential. It's, you know, it's been involved in this long-running dispute with Greece over Cyprus and other issues. You know, that really needs to be resolved one way or another. I'm not suggesting that the onus is necessarily entirely on Turkey to do that. You know, it's got into a big fight with Israel, so it has, you know, it's had these problems recently, and you know, and of course, not, you know, not everybody in Turkey is kind of happy at the fact that there is a sort of an Islamic party running the country. You know, some people doubtless hanker after, you know, the old sort of secular order. But as I say, I think, you know, the potential is there.
Okay, unfortunately, we do have to move on, but I'd like to thank Mr. Worsnip once again. Please join me in another round of applause.